My name is Dalia Gesualdi. By ways of introduction, I am currently the CRIMT director. Very happy to be here today. This is another edition of a series that we wish to push forward that enables us to discuss a book from an author and have other colleagues adding up to the comments around the book and opening, and that's really important, the discussion to the floor. So any one of you who would want to make a comment or would have a question, please put it in the chat, or you'll have a moment at the end of the session to actually open your microphone and camera and step in. So it's a great pleasure to welcome today this session around Judy Fudge's last book called Constructing Modern Slavery, Law, Capitalism, and Unfree Labor. So most of you know Judy, but by ways of introduction, Judy is an emeritus professor at McMaster University, and it's a very great pleasure to welcome this author meets readers session around her book. So very briefly, and before turning the microphone to Judy to present the book, I'm going to introduce briefly our three readers. So I will start with Ingrid, and Ingrid Landau next to me here. I hope the camera can turn to her. So
hi, everyone.
There you go. So we have the great pleasure to welcome today Ingrid in our offices in Montreal, because she is currently doing a research sojourn at McGill University, but Ingrid is at Monash University in Australia. Ingrid is an Australian labor law specialist, but also works in the comparative way also very strongly, has worked on human rights due diligence and transnational regulation in the past few years. So thank you very much, Ingrid, for joining us today. I'm going to pursue with Jérôme Lussier here, who's in the room with us also in our Montreal offices. So I'm going to give Jérôme Lussier's official title, but it's not the hat that he's wearing today. So Jérôme today is the head of government relations at the president of the University of Montreal's office, but he previously had other roles, and that's in that perspective that he will make his comments today. So Jérôme was chief of staff of Julie Méville-Deschênes, who was a Canadian senator who successfully introduced the first Modern Slavery Act in Canada. So we will have a policy perspective here today around the table, a Canadian policy perspective. Last but not least, online with us today, Genevieve LeBaron, who is a distinguished Simon Fraser University professor of global supply chains. So thank you again, Genevieve, for coming with us on board virtually. So Genevieve is a very known specialist on forced labor in global supply chains, and she will also be a reader on the session today. So I will turn the microphone and camera to Judy, and we'll then turn to our readers. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thanks very much, Dalia, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the amazing CRIMT team for inviting me and organizing this talk. And I really appreciate the great crew of readers that you've organized, Genevieve, Ingrid, and Jérôme, and I appreciate you spending the time. I also see some friends on the participant list, and I'm really pleased that to talk to you today because writing this book was a long and lonely endeavor. So I'm very happy to learn how it's read by others and to discuss it with you. Part of the reason why it took me so long to write this book was because my initial focus was on how different forms of unfree labor and labor exploitation came to be seen as modern slavery, and why a labor law approach, instead of one using the criminal law, was a better way of resolving the problem. But I hit an impasse. As a feminist who studies what law treats as labor, I felt I had to address sex work and its relationship to unfree labor and modern slavery. But most of the literature on human trafficking and modern slavery treats labor and sexual exploitation separately, even though a great many forms of work are exploitative, and gendered forms of exploitation, which include sexual violence and harassment, permeate many occupations and sectors, such as domestic work, agricultural work, and garment work, for example. My challenge was to find a way to discuss sexual and labor exploitation and the different governance strategies associated with them without either treating them as essentially different or becoming mired in an unhelpful debate about whether commercial sex work is exploitative. It is, but so are many forms of work. It took me a while to figure my way out of this deadlock, which I did by treating the distinction between labor and sexual exploitation as an artifact of law and governance. This solution gave me the clue to approaching modern slavery as a construct of law and governance, hence the title of the book. I want to be clear. My adoption of a socio-legal constructivist or constitutive approach does not mean that I think that labor exploitation and labor abuse are not real problems. Indeed, they are, and the need to address them is urgent. But labeling these practices as instances of modern slavery, I argue, does not help to eradicate them. Modern slavery is an amalgam of legal concepts defined in international law, united by a shared characteristic. They are all forms of unfree labor. One person deprives another person of their freedom for profit. My book explains how modern slavery's legal expression, how it is defined in law, and the legal domains and jurisdictions to which it is assigned shapes what we see when we see modern slavery and how we go about getting rid of it. This book provides a legal genealogy of modern slavery by tracing the evolution over time of its component legal concepts and how they came together under a single umbrella. It grew out of my puzzlement with developments in the United Kingdom. When I moved to the University of Kent in 2013, I encountered a lively debate about how to define and combat modern slavery. In Canada, where I had been living and working, modern slavery was occasionally used as a political rhetoric to vilify instances of exploitation. I was, however, familiar with the term unfree labor and how it was used as an analytic concept for work relations in which direct physical, political, and legal compulsion is used to acquire and exploit labor. In the United Kingdom, modern slavery became a quasi-legal concept with the enactment of the Modern Slavery Act 2015, which combines wide-ranging criminal prohibitions against human trafficking for sexual and labor exploitation with light-touch business regulation designed to make large transnational corporations disclose what they have done to eliminate modern slavery in their businesses and supply chains. I was very curious about how modern slavery came to be the predominant legal lens for characterizing unfree labor in the UK. I traced the origins of the UK's Modern Slavery Act to the United Nations Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, which was adopted in 2000. While doctrinal legal scholarship is essential for identifying the origins of modern slavery's legal components, its interpretation, and its application, it can't explain why a specific definition was crafted or why it was lodged in one legal domain, criminal law, for example, instead of another, for instance, human rights. To answer these questions, I had to move from legal analysis to study the social world. Researchers in political science and sociology have shown how the problem of modern slavery is framed, influences the different legal domains, criminal law, human rights law, immigration law, labor law, or business regulation, for example, are selected to address it. Frames are the mental structures we use to make sense of the world. They are the often unconscious constructs that shape the way we see the world. They tell us how different pieces of information connect, what is right and wrong, and suggest solutions to correct perceived wrongs. To understand how frames work, consider the sale of sexual services and human trafficking for sexual exploitation. For many people, the exchange of sexual services for money is an anathema. It is an essentially exploitative activity that undermines human dignity. Under this frame, the purchase and sale of sexual services should be banned by criminal law. But for other people, the gendered nature of commercial sexual services, the fact that most sellers are women and most purchasers men, reflects the sexual objectification of women. This women's equality frame treats prostitution as a form of violence against women, and the solution is to prohibit the purchase of sexual services. According to both of these frames, prostitution is itself a form of exploitation, and exploitation is a key element of the international definition of human trafficking. By contrast, some people, like me, see the sale of sexual services as a livelihood strategy in the context of constrained choices, constraints including patriarchal social relations. For this reason, the sale of sexual services should be regulated by labor law to prevent exploitation. Laden with assumptions and meanings, frames are devices that help us select and categorize information and imbue it with moral significance. Thus, the literature on how societies frame modern slavery is crucial for understanding how different forms of exploitation are conceptualized within public policy and how this influences what is considered to be the appropriate legal response. I drew on the critical modern slavery literature to place key legal concepts in their cultural, political, and economic context, and to trace their use and evolution over time. By bringing the legal and social-political literatures into conversation, I try to show how social and political context shapes legal meaning and how legal concepts and technicalities in turn shape how we see the world. Modern slavery covers a wide range of different forms of exploitation, from forced marriage to forced sale of bodily parts. My book focuses on a subset of modern slavery, forms of unfree labor associated with international labor migration and transnational supply chains for two reasons: to offer insights into the relationship between unfree labor and capitalism on the one hand, and to explore how sovereignty is being reconfigured on the other. The discovery of modern slavery as a global problem coincided with and reinvigorated debates about how to conceptualize unfree labor in relation to capitalism. Historically associated with pre-capitalist forms of economic organization, unfree forms of labor, such as chattel slavery, indenture, debt bondage, and servitude, were regarded as the antithesis of free wage labor. According to prevailing economic wisdom, unfree labor was supposed to disappear as capitalism deepened and expanded. However, unfree forms of labor have attracted increasing attention. By investigating attempts to address forms of unfree labor linked to international migration and global supply chains, my book reveals the extent to which anti-slavery initiatives are linked to the fading legitimacy of contemporary global neoliberal capitalism. I argue that modern slavery laws are attempts to mediate the escalating tensions around borders and markets created by global capitalism's reliance on managed migration and free trade as engines of accumulation. Modern slavery involving migrant workers and supply chains is a transnational problem because it crosses national borders. But nation states lack the legal authority, the jurisdiction to deal with it. International law supports national sovereignty and frames it in territorial terms. A state has jurisdiction, the authority to exercise legal power over its territory. Initiatives to combat unfree labor linked to transnational processes do not fit with understandings of jurisdiction tied to the territory of the nation state. Consequently, a thick web of international, regional, national, and local legal instruments have been fabricated to eradicate the global problem of modern slavery. An anti-slavery network composed of key states, non-governmental organizations, transnational corporations and their charitable foundations, and national and international institutions grew alongside it. In this context, the nation state, which used to be the primary governance actor, is now but one amongst an assemblage of actors in what I call the Global Anti-Slavery Governance Network. To explore the governance strategies of this network, I adopted a conception of transnational law that places processes of local, national, international, and transnational public and private lawmaking and practice in dynamic tension within a single analytic. I also distinguish law from other forms of social ordering by emphasizing law's distinctive institutions, courts, prisons, police, lawyers, and forms, contract, legislation, case law, and its alignment with state and juridical sovereign power, its coercive power. Transnational law also captures the multi-scalar dimension of modern slavery law, since the institutions and organizations involved in its production transcend or span the nation state, even though these laws are generally directed at the nation state, since national sovereignty continues to be accepted as the predominant form of legitimate authority. Modern slavery laws exemplify transnational law since they combine international, national, and sometimes regional laws. To make sense of this tangle, I provide case studies of what can be called transnational modern slavery law. I selected 5 cases because they involve the international laws upon which modern slavery is based. They include key actors in the global anti-slavery governance network. They illustrate the scalar interaction of transnational law, and they exemplify different governance approaches to combating modern slavery. 3 cases focus on the international scale. The first is the United Nations adoption of an international criminal law instrument to define human trafficking. The subsequent attempts by U.S. administrations to pin down the meaning of human trafficking and force other states to adopt it, and the development of a multifaceted approach to the problem. The second case is concerned with how Walk Free, a private foundation based in Australia, founded by the mining magnate Andrew Twiggy Forrest, became a key global governance actor by producing knowledge about modern slavery and promoting business-led forms of governance to eliminate it from global supply chains. The third case examines the International Labor Organization's use of its jurisdiction over forced labor to stake a claim in the global anti-trafficking assemblage and to steer global anti-slavery policy away from criminal law towards labor law. Shifting from the international scale, the fourth case explores the European Union as a site of multi-scalar governance that has led the way in adopting binding region-wide anti-trafficking legal norms that augment the human rights of victims. The final case study provides an in-depth account of how anti-slavery governance strategies involving transnational forms of unfree labor in the United Kingdom have changed over time, from New Labour under Blair to the Sunak government and the end of conservative rule at the national scale. Although international and transnational legal instruments define the main legal categories of unfree labor, nation states must implement them and give them meaning. This book argues that how a country filters international norms and approaches through its distinctive cultural political economy shapes its governance strategy. I selected the UK for 3 reasons. First, it was the first country to enact a modern slavery law that combined criminal law with business regulation. Second, as a member of the European Union until early 2020, it was embedded in a multi-scalar legal regime governing human trafficking. And third, it was a prominent member of the Global Anti-Slavery Governance Network, which I think is now dissolving because globalism is now tainted. By providing a genealogy of the amalgam of legal concepts that form transnational modern slavery law, the book reveals how key legal concepts were interpreted and positioned by influential and hegemonic actors in the global anti-slavery governance network, and how a common sense understanding of modern slavery was constructed. This genealogy answers the 5 questions that animated the book. First, how did modern slavery emerge on the global political agenda? Second, where do key actors in the global anti-slavery network draw the boundary between free and unfree labor? Third, how does the multifaceted approach to modern slavery, which adds criminal law to human rights law, to labor law, to business law, to immigration law, how does it keep these different domains from clashing? Fourth, how do attempts to govern transnational forms of unfree labor reconfigure sovereignty? And finally, it attempts to answer the vexed question of what makes labor free. Thank you very much, and I really look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you very much, Judy. Very, very interesting presentation. So I think that I would turn to Ingrid first. We haven't discussed this, so we're deciding in situ how to deal this. But I would go from Ingrid to then Jérôme to then Genevieve, if that's okay with you, Genevieve online, and then Judy. You will have a period to answer and draw from the comments and questions from our readers, and then we will open the floor to the audience. So please, if you have questions, put it in the chat, or you will be able to ask them a little later. So Ingrid.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Dalia, for inviting me to contribute to this discussion of Judy's new book, Constructing Modern Slavery, Law, Capitalism, and Unfree Labour. I'd also like to thank Judy for writing it. It was no doubt very ambitious and a tremendous amount of work, but I think the book itself is a valuable and I think, like I'm going to say, like all Judy's work, a very elegant contribution to understanding modern slavery as a construct of law, politics, and governance. The fact that the book is accessible to everyone to download is also brilliant. I have to confess, I'm going to say from the outset, I share the concerns which I think have been voiced by Judy and of other labour law and critical modern slavery scholars over the way in which the modern slavery paradigm kind of can serve to obscure rather than to reveal the political and economic structures that drive labour exploitation and to reinforce prevailing private labour governance techniques despite their obvious and proven limitations. And I'd like to start just by prefacing my comments by saying that they're informed by my background and expertise in labour law and governance. And I think this is important to note for 2 reasons. Firstly, I'm always very conscious when I kind of engage in the modern slavery space that the way that modern slavery is being constructed and now understood, it encompasses a range of practices and fields of law and governance, including ones in which I have little familiarity and expertise. These include the regulation of sex work, human trafficking, migration, forced marriage, just to name a few. Second, I say this because it's from a labour law perspective, and with a particular concern with the implications of the modern slavery kind of construct for the regulation of work in global supply chains, that I've read this book and from which I approach the task of providing some reflections today. So as Judy's noted, and as I understand it, Judy's book offers this kind of genealogical study of how the construct of modern slavery has come to dominate debates over certain forms of labour exploitation in the contemporary global economy. And adopting a socio-legal kind of constructivist approach, Judy traces the evolution of a set of legal concepts from the mid-1990s through to 2022, and explains how they've been brought together under the umbrella term of modern slavery. And through a case study of, a series of case studies at different scales, Judy reveals how cultural, social, economic contexts have shaped legal meaning, and then how legal meaning and concepts have in turn shaped what we see as the problem and what we think we need to do to fix it. I thought I'd start with a brief reflection on the relevance of Judy's book to the Australian experience, of which I'm most familiar. Australia does not feature as one of the case studies in Judy's book, but she mentions it at various points throughout. And I think the book is undoubtedly of immense value and will resonate with Australian scholars, policymakers, and activists. As Judy observes in her book, Australia is among the small group of states that has enthusiastically embraced modern slavery as the predominant legal lens for conceptualising and addressing free labour. One of the most prominent modern slavery philanthro-capitalists, is the term that Judy uses, and she mentioned today. Twiggy Forrest is, of course, Australian, and the immensely influential Walk Free Foundation, which is now run by his daughter, Grace Forrest, based out of Western Australia. In 2018, Australia followed in UK footsteps and adopted the Modern Slavery Act. Unlike the UK Act, our Act focuses exclusively on reporting of modern slavery risks and how they're managed in operations and supply chains, and it requires very large organisations to produce annual statements addressing a set of mandatory reporting criteria. In adopting this law, Australia embraced an approach to modern slavery that, as Judy discusses in her book, sees labour law, severe forms of labour exploitation in global supply chains, predominantly as a form of market failure, and sees the power of large companies over their supply chains as a key part of the solution rather than as a key part of the problem. The Modern Slavery Act in Australia has undoubtedly driven greater awareness of modern slavery, but it's also driven a massive expansion in related services of law firms, private consultancies, and others who advise and profit from the Modern Slavery Act and its associated governance techniques. This is something that Genevieve has written very well on. Notably, despite an immense amount of activity in the years following the Act, empirical research undertaken by civil society organisations and academics has found not only high levels of non-compliance with the Act, but the failure of many companies to actually identify and address clear risks of severe labour exploitation in the sectors in which they operate. And an independent review of the Act commissioned by the government which was published in May 2023, concluded after extensive consultations that, quote, there is no hard evidence that the Modern Slavery Act in its early years has yet caused meaningful change for people living in conditions of modern slavery. So this 2023 review in Australia prompted some improvements and promises of others to come. The federal government's committed to introducing penalties for non-compliance or false reporting, and to consult on the introduction of a mandatory due diligence regime. We recently got our first national anti-slavery commissioner. However, he has no enforcement or investigative powers and a very modest budget. We haven't adopted a forced labour ban, but the government has indicated support for the creation of a declaration regime identifying high-risk products or regions of origin. So I think in Australia, and I think this is where we diverge from some of the UK, which is kind of written about by Judy in her book, the modern slavery frame has been leveraged to help secure some really positive and important reforms to our temporary labour migration scheme and to the regulation of labour hire agencies, although more needs to be done in this space. As the Australian government loves to point out and does regularly, we also seek to play a leading role in addressing modern slavery in the Asia-Pacific region. And this includes through a lot of business-dominated transnational forums and initiatives, of which Twiggy Forrest is involved in many. And we have an ambassador to counter modern slavery, people smuggling and human trafficking, who's focused on these activities beyond our borders in driving international cooperation. So Judy's book, I think, prompted me to reflect on how Australia's approach to modern slavery emulates and diverges from other jurisdictions. And as Judy's kind of mentioned today, and she shows in her book, cultural, social, economic, and cultural contexts play a formative role in shaping national approaches. And I think in the Australian context, we can add kind of geopolitical context to this mix. I think for Australia, our position in the Asia Pacific and our relations with countries like China really kind of shape and temper the scale and the trajectory of our modern slavery initiatives, particularly those that seek to regulate, however gently, beyond our own borders. My final kind of 3 brief reflections today go to simply things I found myself thinking a lot about after reading Judy's book. And there are also questions for Judy, or at least invitations to respond and reflect if you so wish. And I apologise in advance because these questions are normative and strategic in nature. And I know that your book is kind of a forensic account of modern slavery, as I think I've heard you say before, but I think it invariably begs normative and kind of strategic questions. So very quickly, I think I've got 5 minutes. So reading Judy's book, and particularly the chapter on the EU and its embrace of an alternative approach to responsible business conduct in global supply chains and mandatory human rights due diligence, has prompted me to reflect on current attempts by civil society, trade unions and scholars in Australia and elsewhere to move policymakers and business beyond a narrow modern slavery frame and towards a broader kind of multifaceted approach that encompasses human rights due diligence and labour law reforms. And I'm wondering, I'm keen to hear Judy's views on the viability of these strategies. So I guess in short, is it realistic to hope that certain anti-slavery regulatory initiatives can be expanded and transformed? Can they be, and I think this is a phrase that you used, can they be decoupled from the conservative moral and economic agenda which they are aligned? Building on this, I think we can connect this question to a central analytical tool in the book, which I found kind of very compelling, is how Judy uses the concept of jurisdiction. And she draws on Mariana Valverde's conceptualization of jurisdiction as involving both scalar and governance dimensions. So Valverde combines the 2 dimensions to treat jurisdiction as a legal assemblage that operates as a sort of sorting mechanism that allocates a problem to a particular authority for resolution. And Valverde and Judy in her book explain that this allocation is not, this sorting is not neutral. It dictates the institutions and the techniques that are deployed to address the problem. And as Judy argues, these questions of jurisdiction are often portrayed as technical, but they're in reality political contexts. And I was struck by the resonance of Judy's use of the concept of jurisdiction kind of with arguments that I've tried to advance in the past with respect to multi-scalar contexts over human rights due diligence. In a book kind of I wrote on human rights due diligence and labour governance, I sought to document efforts by the global union movement and human rights NGOs to get human rights due diligence into the ILO, so that the ILO could engage in standard setting with the regulation of work in the global supply chains. And this was seen as kind of holding out, the ILO was seen as holding out a much more labour-oriented approach to addressing certain forms of unfree labour. And I think Judy, through the concept of the use of jurisdiction, as she does, adopts a much more comprehensive and nuanced approach, and I kind of tried to do in my book. But I think both approaches recognise that achieving a more human rights or labour law oriented approach to issues of labour exploitation, unfree labour, is ultimately about shifting or expanding jurisdiction, and it's ultimately a matter of politics. So I'm keen, I was wondering whether, hear from Judy as to whether she thinks there are examples of successful attempts to contest and even broaden or shift jurisdictions with respect to labour exploitation in global supply chains, either in its scalar or its governance dimensions, and what lessons we can learn from these attempts. My final question goes to another theme of the book, and that's the way that modern slavery is a problem and the global anti-slavery governance network techniques and approaches challenge traditional notions of state sovereignty. And I think Judy's kind of discussion of sovereignty is a really valuable part of the book. And I was kind of left wondering about the opportunities as well as the challenges this presents. So in the book, as I understand it, Judy discusses how initiatives to combat unfree labour linked to transnational processes do not, of course, fit with our traditional notions of jurisdiction tied to the territory of the nation state. A number of instruments and techniques associated with modern slavery, of which laws with extraterritorial implications, like modern slavery laws and human rights due diligence laws, are a particular form, challenge, if not transcend, traditional territorial notions of sovereignty. And they also, as Judy noted today, compel nation states to engage more with other actors, public and private actors. So I guess my final kind of question for Judy is whether you see these shifts as potentially opening up spaces, possibilities, opportunities for the expansion of aspects of national labour law and governance systems beyond their territorial focus. So whether we can, again, leverage some of these dynamics in a positive way going forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So you already have a lot to say, probably, Judy. So you're gonna have to wait and keep on the edge of your chair. I'm gonna turn to Jérôme Lussier for maybe more of a Canadian perspective on what the book offers us. So Jérôme, the floor is yours.
Hello all. I think I feel I need to begin with a short introduction of myself. Just because I need to first apologize for not being an academic. And probably it's a good thing that I'm sandwiched in between two proper academics so they can elevate the level of the discussion. The reason I'm here, I understand it, is because I was directly involved for at least 2 years in shepherding and essentially successfully passing Canada's modern slavery statute. I was struck when listening to Professor Fudge's introduction about sort of feels that the thrust of the book is to sort of explain what came before modern slavery was adopted as a concept, and it was very interesting for me because when I arrived in politics, the bill had already been written, and I was tasked with getting it through Parliament, and so it also felt like I was dealing with something without knowing fully what came before it. So that was a very illuminating read for me. Speaking perhaps about the Canadian bill, and it was very helpful to get a sort of a sense of what happens in Australia. The Australian legislation actually was a very important source of inspiration for the Canadian statute that was eventually adopted. It felt like the more modern iteration of UK statute, and we tried in good faith, I think, to improve on that Australian bill. I want to maybe note 3 things which may lead to interesting conceptual discussions afterward. One is we lowered the threshold of application somewhat. I think Australia has $100 million threshold for the size of the businesses that need to report. We lowered it to $40 million Canadian, which is a substantially lower threshold, which means it covers more companies. We, I think, somewhat expanded the definition of forced and child labor, which again, to me, resonated when reading about sort of the vagueness of unfree labor. For me, that sort of touched on that point. One of the elements of the Canadian legislation is that it defines child labor in part by using the ILO definition, which then refers to, improper interference with schooling, for example, which I thought was an interesting concept as not something you're used to seeing in legislation. And the third thing we did was we did sort of introduce some elements of business law by requiring Canadian federally incorporated corporations to publish their modern slavery statement in their annual reports, which makes it a sort of a formal corporate disclosure, which then triggers a number of obligations and the potential for class actions, for example, which tends to be successful in focusing business people's attention on a problem. Focusing now perhaps on more substantive reactions to the book. I mean, I think my perspective as a practitioner of politics and policy, even to this day, is the difference, of course, between what might be sort of conceptually desirable and what is practically possible. Politics is the art of the possible, and this is very much the framework that we used when developing the legislation. In this respect, I do not disagree at all with the fundamental premise of the book that transparency legislation, modern slavery legislations, such as now exists in Canada, does not seek to fundamentally transform or challenge capitalism. In fact, this was reading the book made this very obvious to me when I remember how we sold the bill to various audiences. We typically used two lines of argument when meeting with stakeholders, when approaching more human rights-based organizations or religious groups, for example. We would highlight that we are trying to deal with instances of fundamentally wrong, repulsive affronts to human dignity. Nobody can tolerate, as the deprivation of human freedom and exploitation of children and others. So that was the sort of moral argument that we would put forward. But we also had to pitch the bill to business audiences. And the first pitch, the moral pitch, was sort of agnostic on capitalism, I would say. It wasn't a ringing endorsement, but it was not a condemnation either. But when we pitched the bill and the framework to businesses or business groups, we typically framed it as a pro-capitalist bill in a way. What we said is we need to level the playing field, which is an expression that the book uses. We presented this legislation as allowing for fair competition between businesses that, quote unquote, play by the rules, and i.e. pay their employees, and those who cheat by essentially employing slaves. And that argument, that's a very capitalist argument, actually resonated with business audiences, and this is how they typically came to support the bill. And so in this way, I think what I'm trying to say is I agree with the characterization of this legislation as not being revolutionary when it comes to the dominant economic order that we live under. That said, of course, the practical realities of politics came roaring back, and I was surprised and not amused, just surprised and intrigued by reading, for example, that and I understand why that is the case, but that, for example, mandatory human rights due diligence was lumped together with modern slavery transparency bill as being, not the same thing, but two frameworks that more or less failed to challenge capitalism as though they were the same thing, quote unquote. That to me was interesting because from a practical political standpoint, these two frameworks are actually the floor and the ceiling of the Overton window in a way. I mean, it feels like these days it's very difficult for anyone to argue for less than a transparency bill. It's very hard to oppose, but it feels politically impossible to even imagine anything going beyond mandatory human rights due diligence law these days. So to read that these two frameworks were in fact, similar and needed to both be transcended was surprising to me, although I understand what the perspective is. Other thoughts. Of course, in keeping with what I said earlier, politics being the art of the possible, we had to make a decision. Are we going to, as we said it, let the perfect be the enemy of the good, or should we, pass whatever legislation is possible at a given point in time? And of course, that was not my decision; it was the senator's decision. but I supported her in doing that. But it did generate a lot of internal discussion. We had a lot of opposition, but some of the more demanding propositions out there were political non-starters in Canada. And so we obviously opted for what was possible. And I think, as was said by Ingrid, our goal, and it was a stated goal, was not to, single-handedly end modern slavery or unfree labor around the world. Obviously, that's far beyond the ambitions of this bill, but to at least initiate the kinds of discussions that may pave the way for stronger collective action down the road. And we have some indications that this is happening. Whether or not it will be ultimately successful, we don't know. But the fact that there is some level of compliance, that I think 6,000 reports were filed on the first year, and it is forcing businesses to at least think about this. Couple of last thoughts. I wrote on my paper that they were, either pessimistic or optimistic, but I think everyone needs to be the judge of how they think about this. From a purely, I would say, North American policy perspective, one thing that struck me reading the book and following current developments in politics is that it feels that for a long time there was a fairly static and divide between, I would say, progressive movements, putting forward very skeptical views of capitalism, ranging from, complete overthrow of capitalism to center-left sustainable capitalism initiatives. And then on the other side, you would have very libertarian, non-interventionist, complete free market approaches to this. But lately, interesting things are happening in the US. For example, underneath the surface of Trump administration are conservative thinkers who are putting forward ideas that a few years ago might have almost come from the labor movement. And showing, and at least writing things that on the surface at least seem very skeptical of libertarian free market absolutist perspectives. And so I don't know, again, I assume that most of these views do not align with those of progressive activists, but for the policy person that I am, it's an interesting development, and maybe one that paves the way for different kinds of conversations than the ones that we've had in the past. I was very surprised to see large unions in the US endorse President Trump, for example, which is very surprising and unexpected a few years ago. And some of the things that are said are in my view, I don't know if we should be optimistic or pessimistic about this, but maybe could lead to different conversations than we've had before. The other thing that I would say, and I close on this, is that the book, in my view, sort of reflected a view that, but for a number of corporate influences and capitalist dogma and significant constraints on media and public discourse, a number of fundamental policy changes would be enacted, and that we are in some ways prevented from doing the right thing by this network of heavy corporate influence. There's some truth to that, for sure, but I'm not sure it goes, that's probably room for discussion, but I'm not sure it goes all the way to the overthrow of capitalism. But there are, in my view at least, inspiring initiatives coming out of the UK and the US and Canada that seek to not completely do away with capitalism, but maybe redefine it, and broadening the modern slavery perspective. So that's sort of vague closing, but what I wanted to say is I don't think the ultimate end goal of ridding the world of capitalism is within reach, but maybe there are promising avenues being developed in a few places right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and all good topics for further discussion.
Yes.
I would have follow-up questions, but I'm gonna
I'm sure.
refrain myself and hand it on to Genevieve online. Genevieve, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for having me on this panel. And it's really an honor to be here with Dalia, Ingrid, and Jérôme, and everyone who's joined us. And most of all, with Judy, whose work on unfree labor, temporary foreign migrant work, gender and work, labor market regulation, really the entire gamut of topics that are important and relevant in the world of labor has been really formative for me in my own thinking since I first discovered and read her work as a PhD student in Toronto almost 20 years ago. And so it's really exciting to be here with Judy and to celebrate this new book, which I think does an amazing job of pulling together a lot of these threads of different things Judy's worked on over the years into one big narrative centered around modern slavery. So that's kind of the first thing that I'll say. I'll just start by sharing a few brief reflections on the book, and then I'm gonna pull 3 quotes from the conclusion that I really like, that I think beg for further discussion and open up some questions for us. So first, on the reflections on the book's contribution, I mean, I think this is a monumental book. I really think this is such an important book. As Judy said in her introductory comments, it provides, and I love this phrase, a genealogy of modern slavery. It traces the evolution of its component legal concepts and how they came together under this umbrella term. And as a scholar of forced labor in supply chains, so I'm a political scientist, I'm not a lawyer. You know, my work occasionally runs into the law, but certainly I don't have that kind of legal background here. I found this to be incredibly helpful in explaining a lot of these legal concepts, how they've shaped the way that we've come to see the problem of forced labor and overlapping forms of exploitation and abuse, and how governments and others have come to try to deal with them. So I think there's a huge contribution there in pulling together this, you know, what I'm sure seems obvious to lawyers, but for people like me, it's incredibly helpful to have this big, rich overview of these legal concepts and how they've evolved over time as this modern slavery framing has come to be so important. And I was reflecting as I was reading that, you know, even though I've had a kind of front row seat to a lot of the developments that the book is looking at in policy terms. So for instance, the UK Modern Slavery Act, some of the conventions. I had a lot of new insights about these initiatives, how they fit together with others, the significance of the legal developments as I was reading this book. It's really hard, I think, in the moment to see, you know, what the significance of like this important meeting is or this discussion of this term. When you read this book, it really brings them all together in a way that shows how this landscape evolved and how these debates in different moments, like in meetings around, you know, different initiatives to create conventions or create legislation, were highly significant in what we ended up with in terms of the regulation that we have. And so I really look forward to teaching this book. I'm on research leave this year, but as I was reading it, I was thinking, I think, you know, students will really benefit from how accessible and how comprehensive it is, especially for people who are, you know, new to this area or coming into it from, say, the labor work side or the sex work side, or, you know, a particular expertise. This is really helpful in bringing us all onto the same page of kind of understanding across the different concepts that have come together in modern slavery, where these came from, how they fit together, what some of the tensions are. It's just really helpful for that. I think one of the greatest contributions of the book, kind of building on what I was just saying, is that, you know, Judy maps out the concepts of modern slavery, but it spans such a huge set of areas, right? So it pulls from criminal, immigration, labor, human rights, business regulation, trade, both the legal and strictly legal, but then also the governance side that also includes private actors and NGOs. And these are all things that are very often looked at in isolation. So I was struck when I was reading the book that, you know, it seems to me at least so rare to find a holistic analysis that covers all those different areas of law. As a non-lawyer, you know, I sometimes get a little bit frustrated when I get into the legal literature because it's so deep in the weeds of one concept or kind of one piece of legislation. And I'm sure there's tremendous value in that. Like, I understand that y'all have things to do as lawyers other than educate me, political scientist, about how things fit together. But it is such a rare and precious thing to have somebody who can zoom out and sort of say, okay, across all these domains, you know, this is what's happened, this is how it fits together, and this is kind of what it adds up to as a governance arena. And Judy really is such a rare big picture thinker who's able to synthesize across these vast areas of law, wildly different themes. And so I really think this book consolidates so many things that are often looked at separately, and there's tremendous value in that. And of course, one of the values is that it brings into focus a lot of tensions in this arena between different types of laws, different instruments, the different politics that underpin them. And I think it tells us that even though modern slavery law or modern slavery regulation is now thought of in some ways as a kind of a coherent thing, this is not a coherent policy arena. And that's one of the things I love about the book. It really shows us how all these different efforts add up to a fragmented, sometimes contradictory, sometimes in tension with each other whole. And I think the analysis of immigration really is one of the areas where that comes through, the tensions there. I found the chapter on the ILO quite interesting, especially some of the legal challenges around governing forced labor in supply chains and the 2014 Forced Labor Convention, the controversy around supply chains in the 2016 ILC. And I think there's an interesting argument here, which I'd be very curious if ILO colleagues with us have any thoughts on, but that the ILO's approach has been quite different. So there's an argument that the due diligence approach, for instance, is grounded in the labor market analysis and frame and emphasizes the role of things like freedom of association, collective bargaining, social dialogue in relation to forced labor, and that's distinctive from other kind of international organizations and government actors. And I certainly see a lot of merit in that, but also know it's been a controversial area. And so I think it's one that I'm very curious, you know, how others who are closer to that work would see that argument. Yeah, so I think just to shift to the questions that it raises, this is, as I said, I think a really tremendous book. It opens up a lot of questions for discussion. And I was conscious that even in the short time between when the book was published and now, you know, there have been some rapid developments that are worth, I think, talking about and hearing Judy's thoughts on. One of them connects to, I think, a bit with what Jérôme was just saying, which is, you know, this piece about neoliberalism and neoliberal capitalism. And I just want to say, Judy, how nice it is to read a book about modern slavery that doesn't shy away from the biggest possible economic questions, which are very rarely included in analysis on this topic. So I love that. And there's a quote in the conclusion from Judy that says, modern slavery laws are attempts to mediate the escalating tension around borders and markets created by neoliberal capitalism's reliance on managed migration and free trade. And I mean, I'm surprised by what I'm about to say, but it's true, which is that as I was reading this, I was almost struck by a sense of nostalgia. Like, oh, we complained a lot about neoliberalism and, you know, the modern slavery governance agenda linked to neoliberalism. And however flawed and limited that was, I guess I'm finding myself feeling a little bit nostalgic about it these days, in the sense that, you know, now it sometimes feels like there's nothing there seeking to mediate the tension around borders and markets. And it feels like neoliberalism has indeed given way to something else, but that it's not necessarily, the pro-labor kind of improvements that we might have hoped would replace the modern slavery governance arena. And so, even as it's brought into focus all of the cracks that were there all along in the modern slavery governance arena, and, none of us expected it to kind of last forever, given how precarious it always has been and all these tensions in it. I guess I still wonder, how are we feeling about that now that we have a bit of a shift in, certainly, I don't think it would be fair to say that the modern slavery laws are mediating that in the same way, but what we have, how do you see what we have instead, I guess is the question. The second one is around the place of human rights due diligence. Can it be salvaged? Will it be fit for the purpose of addressing forced labor? There have been some interesting developments with HRDD since the book was published that I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on, Judy. And you have some great quotes in the conclusion about mandatory human rights due diligence and that they run the risk of being counterproductive for addressing business practices, and that they can result in cosmetic compliance or institutionalized human rights due diligence as a defense to liability. And I guess it's a similar question that, as even HRDD, which was never the boldest approach in my view when it comes to forced labor, is now under strain and being rolled back in different ways. I'm curious how you're seeing that. And then the final question is really, there's a great quote in the conclusion: crusading for the elimination of modern slavery without changing the legal rules that vest unaccountable power in corporations obscures the ongoing and fraught relationship between freedom and power. And I'd love to hear some discussion about corporations and corporate power and how that's evolving. I think, there have been some great arguments, including in this book, that the modern slavery laws have given companies cover to sort of say they're doing something progressive and socially and labor focused without really changing the status quo of their business practices. And again, I'm curious how you're seeing that evolving now, that it seems that some companies are saying, well, actually, we're not even going to do that anymore. We don't care at all now. We're just, there's certainly some who are doing great initiatives, as Jérôme mentioned, but there are others who are saying, oh, cool, the politicians don't really care about this anymore, and we're also going to just scrap our sustainability offices or programs entirely. And I'm curious how you're grappling with that in this moment. So thank you again for this wonderful book and this great occasion to talk about it. And congratulations, Judy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Genevieve. I think we'll turn it back to Judy. You have a whole stack of comments and questions to tackle. Good luck on that. Very, very interesting conversation. So Judy, you can open your microphone whenever you want. And then, as I said, please, audience, feel free to put your question in the chat, or we'll open it up for discussion after. So Judy.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate the generous read and the thoughtful reflections from a lawyer like Ingrid, who's done a huge amount of work that I benefited from, understanding how various forms of corporate due diligence can be used as a way to regulate labor. Thank you, Jérôme, for pointing out the pragmatic political reasons, and I agree with you. The perfect should never be the enemy of the good. Every time I vote, I hold my nose and say that thing, right? And thirdly, thank you so much, Genevieve, for the nice tribute and for all of the great questions. Okay. It is a forensic book, so I completely agree. And I do beg the question of how to move forward. My first thing is that I should have been clear that I see neoliberalism as different from global neoliberalism. I see neoliberalism is the notion that the market is the only legitimate form of calculation of social value. maybe the church seeps in, but you know, I look at Twiggy and I think, well, somehow he's managed to get the church in with the Marquette as well. And that was the big thing that Walk Free did, I think, was to bring together religious groups in a moral valiance with a notion of corporate self-regulation. So I see neoliberalism as a particular stance around the corporation and markets. I think neoliberalism is still incredibly strong. I think globalism is not strong. So I would see our particular moment now as more of a populist neoliberalism or an authoritarian neoliberalism. So that's, and I am nostalgic for managed capitalism, right? So I'm back to before the idea of shareholder value, before the idea of deregulating markets, where competition law was decided not on the basis of whether consumers had short-term lower costs, but in terms of how market function. So I would be happy to go back to a managed capitalism of before the Trilateral Commission and the Bond Summit of 1978. So that would be my view. And that's when there was a crisis of profitability, this notion that profits are all that matters and in a short term. So that's where I see neoliberalism as that configuration, and it has different kinds of forms. It can be globalism. I think it was very tied in the Washington consensus to globalism. So I think managed capitalism, what can we do? So I might want to get rid of capitalism. I do want to get rid of neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalism. I would be happy to go back to managed capitalism. And I see some of the things that came out of the Biden administration, although I'm not completely keen on all of that, the way they were using competition law, those kinds of things I think are really, really important. I think more regulation on private capital is really important because I think private capital funds are hugely bad. I think the incorporation of people like Musk into government agencies is an example of neoliberalism. So what are the strategies? So the reason why I am engaging in forensic analysis is because I want to think of what is causing the problem in order to think about how to strategize to move forward. And I understand the need to want to stretch a frame so that you can find a space in it. But my fear is that you can only stretch a frame so far without it kind of pinging back on you. So in the UK, it's not surprising to me that modern slavery became a way of vilifying undocumented migrants because of the particular context. And I'm heartened that that didn't occur in Australia. And I think Ingrid's right, because it was a different moment around and a different political economy and attempts by some of the states to actually regulate. So mandatory human rights due diligence, Nick Hammer, I saw was here, and I really like his article in Transfer because I don't know why we would think that having large transnational corporations cascade norms down to suppliers who are beholden to them will ultimately change the practices of suppliers when we don't use home state regulation to make corporations more accountable in our own jurisdictions. So I think that we have to think of how we can regulate our corporate behemoths and I think Canada has many corporate behemoths, like we're the worst in the extractive sector in the world, which is part of the reason why Twiggy came after Canada so much, because it's in the mining sector. So I think that those kinds of things, I see what's happening now with all sorts of groups supporting mandatory human rights due diligence because they see it as being watered down, as really, that's not the way I would go. I think we need to support freedom of association. We need strong workers' voice. We need better public disclosure laws. We need to regulate private capital. So those would be much more of the ways that I would think. I also think reparations would help certain countries to deal with some of the problems that they have. Now, it's true, those don't seem to be on the horizon, but nothing is on the horizon until we can actually challenge the dominant frames that obscure different imaginaries. So my big fear right now is we don't have a way of seeing things like the EU is going to water down the corporate sustainability due diligence directive. Germany already has started. The research that on the Norwegian Act shows that the reports report nothing. And I spent a couple of hours this morning looking at Canadian modern slavery reports. They don't even identify their suppliers. They simply identify the for-profit companies that Genevieve has identified as they're taking over their role. So I really do think we need to say, look, it's not cheap products that we're getting. We're actually getting shareholder value, and we're all kind of implicated in it because our pension funds are in it, and our federal pension plans are in it in Canada, right? The Canadian pension plan is in the equities market. And I think that's really volatile. And that's what I mean by neoliberalism, that all aspects of our life are tied up in these things. So alternative frameworks is to talk about worker agency, to actually understand that mandatory human rights due diligence laws that puts forest sustainability and clean water in a village together with workers' freedom of association, like how in one law would you do these things? I mean, trees can't complain, but workers know how to complain and have historically been able to. And even in repressive regimes, workers still get killed, challenging repressive labor practices. So I guess I'm thinking of going back to really old style ways of challenging suppliers, right? And we need more robust demands around freedom of association and more robust on corporate accountability and challenging things like limited liability and separate legal personality, which I just think is so absurd, right? So that's kind of where I'm thinking of going. That's the old style work I like.
Thank you. Circling back to your early work also, Judy, I guess. I don't know if anyone wants to step in at this point to ask a question or make an additional comment, remark to this very interesting discussion. I'm not in control of the chat, but I don't see any questions popping, any other comments, or else I'm gonna have to ask a question. I won't be able to refrain myself. So once, twice. So, I mean, you just mentioned this, Judy, but I'd like to hear you, and I guess I'm slightly influenced by the current political context we are facing in Quebec, but I think one thing, so hearing what you had to say and having read your book, on the idea of worker voice again, and how can these frameworks can or cannot accelerate worker voice, and how, in a way, some of the legal frameworks of modern slavery acts, but at least the way I understand them, and I am not a specialist, I'm surrounded by these specialists, tend to borrow concepts from labor law. So forced labor, child labor, these concepts that are crystallized in different legal frameworks. But then what seems to be less crystallized, and you've mentioned this, or less borrowed, are the processes and the way we have to constantly rethink the governance of these concepts concretely, and by accelerating worker voice and the ones that ultimately benefit or should benefit from these measures at the end of the supply chain. So I'd like to open the discussion on that. You said it, it's basically how do we, and the way Ingrid put it was very interesting, how do we bring, make a basically interdependence of these legal frameworks, and how can we make them really influence one another? But there's concepts, and then there's processes, and how do we redefine, and how do we convey new ways of thinking about these issues as the world is changing, and with or without worker voice. So I don't know, I'm going a bit everywhere here, but I'm sure you understand where I'm heading. So I'd like to hear you on that. Worker voice, processes, concepts, how do we ensure interference of different frameworks to actually be able to build on what we've known in terms of ways of addressing these issues, I guess. Your microphone's closed, Judy.
Sorry, thanks very much. I was talking to someone, I was doing a bit of work on forced labor import bans, which I'm not keen on. I don't like them because there's nothing in a forced labor import ban that requires there to be any remediation for workers. And they are clearly a protectionist device. And so I want to say, okay, so why are we doing these things? So I was talking to this person, I was saying, why do you support forced labor import bans? They don't protect workers. And this was a workers advocate. And they said, well, they protect Canadian workers. You don't care about the workers in Bangladesh. Oh, okay. Okay, so you're a populist, you're a nationalist. Okay. So we have this kind of notion that it's a zero-sum game, right? We have kind of a prisoner's dilemma or a zero-sum game where, the US unions, not all of them, but the Teamsters head of the Teamsters spoke at for Trump. Sean Fine supports tariffs. I mean, it's this zero-sum game that somehow national borders it's those outsiders who are causing the problem, not actually it's your boss who lives in the town who's causing the problem. So I think that we need to start challenging, and it's very hard. We don't control the media. They frame things. They hire the best behavioral economists. They hire the best social psychologists. But we have to find ways to talk about these things, I think, that identifies the problem not as the other, but as part of us, and to see how that works. So I did not study corporate law. I had to kind of learn it myself. Well, I must admit, my only corporate law course was called Corporation as Criminal, so you can see my bent. But we have to denaturalize this. We have to denaturalize that corporations are the only way of organizing production. They're not. There are different ways of organizing it. You could have corporations without limited liability or separate legal personality. Why is it that a headquartered company is not responsible for the activities of its subsidiaries? Why is it that a worker who's employed in a factory in Bangladesh and who's harmed by demands that we can show are connected to the scheduling and ordering and pricing, contracting arrangements of the home country state? Why does privity prevent a claim? Why isn't that treated as a tort? So there are all these things that we have naturalized over the past 120 years that were deeply contested, right? Separate legal personality, limited liability were considered anathema initially. How have we accepted them as normal? And we do. So I think we should be challenging those kinds of things. And we can show that people are angry about these things. Like, when we find out about when they pollute our water, when they give us toxic chemicals. So I think we need to be thinking of a broader scale movement that identifies the particular benefits that corporations have through their legal form that normal human beings aren't able to exercise. So I think we need to look at those kinds of fundamentals and call them out, and we need to be humorous about it. We need to be able to make jokes about it, but we also need to be able to have the vocabulary to talk about it so that it's not just corporations are evil, but to show exactly how it is that the mechanisms allow them to behave in ways that are harmful to the rest of society. So we can think of some Joel Bakken's work on the corporation, the films that he's done, some of Harry Glassbeek's work, Paddy Ireland's work, and finding ways to popularize them so that we see it. We don't see the corporation as kind of this unchanging thing, but as a particular construct that can be unpacked. And we need to actually show more, I think, about the relationship between corporate concentration and immiseration.
Thank you. I don't know if there's any other comments or points of view here that want to be shared, Jérôme, Genevieve, or Ingrid, or else I really want to thank Judy for your very inspired last comments. It gives us a lot to think about. Thank you everyone for being here today. It was really a great pleasure to host this. And we will have other sessions soon, so we will keep you informed. Thank you again, Ingrid, Genevieve online, and Jérôme for reading the book and sharing your thoughts. And we wish you all a pleasant evening or afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you so much.
Thank you.